I have a goal right now of personally helping 1,000 people grow their businesses. If you want to help me reach that goal, then take a second and share this episode. Thank you so much. What's up, and welcome back to the Matt Pete Marketing Podcast. And today I've got Melissa Guller. She is the founder of Wit Wire, where she helps creators turn their skills and passions into profitable online businesses. She's a top-rated instructor at General Assembly and Skillshare, and she's previously worked full-time for Teachable and Ramit Sethi. To date, she's taught thousands of students through her online courses, and she's on a mission to help more women earn money online doing work they love. Welcome to the podcast, Melissa.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Matt.
For everybody listening, Melissa has a ton of resources on her website. Like I literally, like, before our call today, I probably spent 45 minutes on your website just scrolling through. I was reading about microphones and everything. Like, I was learning stuff, and I've had podcasts for years now. So absolutely amazing resources. But I wanted to go ahead and off the bat here, tell people that you've put something free together. So do you want to tell them what that is?
Yeah, I'd love to. So for anybody considering launching a podcast, I know that it can feel daunting to wonder, where do I even get started? So I have a free podcast launch checklist that you can download. It walks through the 3 major phases of launching and some of the things you'll want to hit along the way. And you can grab that at witandwire.com/MattPete.
There you go. Wit and Wire. That's WIT and Wire, WIRE.com/MattPete. And you get that free podcast launch checklist. And it's super amazing. I downloaded it a minute ago. Melissa, you also have a full-on podcasting course, which I think is amazing. So go to her website while you're there, check out the full course, and it might be a great fit for you. So Melissa, let's jump into talking about podcasts. So why did you decide to start your podcast, Wit and Wire?
It's funny. The Wit and Wire podcast is my 4th podcast.
Nice.
And I know you've got more than one. Something about getting into the world of podcasting just makes you want to keep creating. But when I first launched my initial podcast, it was just as a test to see if I enjoyed interviewing other guests. I felt like it would be a great way to connect with people. And so the evolution of podcasting for me has gone from podcast number 1, maybe I didn't choose quite the right topic. It's not in the running anymore as an active show, but it led me to realize how much I enjoyed creating podcast episodes. And that's when I pivoted a bit to launch a podcast called Booksmart about personal development books. And that was just for fun with me and my co-host, Em. We got together, we shared our top takeaways from some of our favorite books. And then through the organic growth of that podcast, I learned so much about the industry that I ended up pitching the CEO of Teachable, my then full-time job, that I thought Teachable should have a podcast for the brand to show people what it was like to be a course creator instead of what it was like to use a course creation software to show more human sides to the brand. And then that podcast became the number 2 career podcast in America. And after that full journey, I realized that it was so mysterious, this world of tech in podcasting. And frankly, a lot of men were talking about it, but not as many women at the time a few years ago. There certainly were a few, but it was definitely dominated by more men in the industry. So I thought, let me combine my podcasting experience, my teaching experience, and my digital marketing experience all together to help more women launch their own shows. And that's how Wit and Wire came to be.
Awesome. So Wit and Wire, what is the goal of Wit and Wire, your podcast?
So the podcast is a marketing channel for the business. And the whole purpose of the business is to empower more women to earn money online, particularly through what is commonly called the creator economy or the knowledge economy. So it's where you aren't selling a physical good. Instead, you are earning money by sharing your knowledge with other people through things like coaching or courses. And so podcasting happened to be the first outlet, the first thing I thought I could help people with. But in general, the mission of the business is much larger, moving into things like helping women sell online courses and just put themselves out there, either part-time or full-time, to earn more income.
I love that, because I love the whole online community, online space. And I was actually talking to my wife before we jumped on our interview today, and I was telling her, I was like, yeah, I'm super excited for today's episode. It's about podcasting. I was like, and honestly, Melissa's website looks really awesome. Like, you've got a quality website, and like all of the courses, like everything is just so lined up so well. I think you've really got something awesome over at Wit and Wire. That's for sure.
Thank you. It's really rewarding to work in the online creator space, and I know you're in it too. And I think with podcasting, a mistake I could have made would be to try to just talk about podcasting and to serve anybody who wants a podcast. But if you look at the breadth of podcasts, even on your own iPhone, let's say, you could listen to true crime next to a comedy podcast, next to Netflix, next to the Matt Pete podcast. Like there's so many different shows that you have. They just happen to be an Apple, but the goals of all of those pieces of media are so different. And I think it's tricky because video isn't like that. You've got YouTube, you've got TV, you've got movies, you've got Reels or TikTok. Video comes in all forms, but podcasting is all housed under one roof. And so trying to appeal to all podcasters would have been too broad of an audience. And that's why I narrowed down to online business owners.
And that speaks to like niching. I'd never really thought of it that way, but that's so true. And having that niche audience. So for you, starting out, trying to decide what your podcast was going to be, what would you say is like the number one piece of advice for somebody out there who either is excited to start a podcast or is kind of like, what is this podcasting thing about? What would you say is like the best piece of advice for coming up with the idea of the podcast and kind of that beginning creation process?
I think there are two mistakes people can make. The first is that they see a lot of successful podcasts on the topic that they're interested in and think, oh, it's been done, so I shouldn't go into that arena as well. But the truth is that all of those other podcasts on the topic validate demand for your show. And what you will bring to the table that's different is not that you've invented something brand new that's never been done before. It's that you have a unique perspective. You have a different life story, different professional experience. So a good example is the world of true crime, even though it's totally different from business. If the theory was true that only one podcast could exist, then Serial would have come out and that would have been the end of the story. But when Serial came out, then dozens and then hundreds more true crime podcasts started to pop up because it validated demand for the industry. So that's the first mistake, is that if you see another podcast on your topic, see that as a positive, see it as a sign of listeners out there. And then the second mistake I see is that people choose a topic, but to our earlier conversation, they don't get specific enough on who it's for. So in my courses, I talk about this formula. I call it the winning podcast formula, where you need a topic, you need an ideal listener, and you need a clear benefit for that person. So maybe somebody says, I want to start a podcast about yoga, about parenting. Those are so broad because yoga for somebody with hip pain is very different from yoga for general wellness or for teenagers. And so knowing who you're talking to will really shape the lens of every single episode that you put out. Or another great example is I have a student and she's a single parent. So because she's talking about all these different topics on parenting, but she herself is a single parent, she becomes the go-to podcast for fellow single parents because there's a really specific point of view on that topic. And then the last piece is the benefit. And some podcasts are informative, others are more entertaining, and you can have a mix of the two, but there has to be something in it for the listener. Either they're learning new skills, they are feeling understood, they're feeling less alone, they understand a platform or a cause better, or they're just laughing. There has to be something in it for them. So I think anybody who's just getting into podcasting, I would recommend nailing down those three elements: the topic, the listener, and the benefit.
That was gold, Melissa. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah. And that's just the start. I mean, we're just barely skimming the surface on people who are getting into podcasting, but I'm sure there's more you want to ask. So let's keep going.
Yeah. So, I mean, and just to reiterate that, everything you just said, I 100% agree with. I actually just launched an episode about podcasting where I talked about like somebody that I talked to about starting a podcast. They definitely need one. They sent me a link to an article talking about 4 reasons why you shouldn't start a podcast. And one of them was because you don't have a unique voice. And I was like, that's such a dumb reason. Like, you have your own unique experiences. You're going to come to a topic with a unique voice. So I love that you kind of drove that home.
Yeah, I completely disagree with that article. I'm sure they're trying to get clicks and trying to build up reads.
Yeah.
I understand being controversial, but to me, it's important to say that I don't believe being unique is something you have to earn. I think it's who you already are. So I don't want people to worry that you don't have a story that feels like you're the one and only, the most unique person. The goal is to be exactly the right fit for your person, not to try to be the best podcast for everyone.
Love the mindset of starting the podcast. So next, I just had a consulting session with somebody who's starting a podcast, the tech. And I know you have, if you want, anybody listening, watching wants to know to deep dive on the tech, Melissa, your website has a ton of resources, microphone reviews and everything. But for somebody getting started, what would you suggest? Hey, here's what you need to have a podcast. right out the gate?
Obvious as it sounds, the microphone really is the number one thing that I would recommend to all new hosts because we are not nearly as forgiving of bad audio as we are, let's say on YouTube, of bad lighting or all these other visual elements of content creation. We know what good audio sounds like. We listen to professionally produced music, high budget cinematic TV and movie productions. We know what audio sounds like when it's good, and we know what a bad Zoom call sounds like when it's awful. So just by investing in a microphone, either under $100 or slightly over for some of the top USB picks, I say that I recommend a USB microphone because it plugs right into your computer. There is a separate piece of equipment people sometimes have questions about called an audio interface. And the interface serves as the middleman between the microphone and a computer, depending on the type of mic that you purchase. But nowadays, what's great for newer hosts is that the technology is so much friendlier than it was even 5 years ago. And so I think just keep it simple, get a USB mic that plugs right into your computer. And that is, I think, the most important investment you could make.
I agree. And I went, like I said, I went on your website and I was looking at your microphone you use, and none of the microphones that you recommend are the microphone that I use. So
Well, tell us what mic you use.
I use the ATR 2100.
Yeah.
And that's like, I feel like everybody who starts, that's like, hey, get this microphone. And like, I know some professional podcasters who still use this microphone. That's why I haven't switched, but like hearing your podcast, or anybody hasn't listened to it, you have the MV7, right? Or what is it?
Yes, I'm using the Shure MV7. We're using it now, although admittedly recording over Zoom will dilute any microphone compared to recording locally on your computer. Yep. But the microphone that you use is still a good choice and recommended by a lot of hosts. The only reason it got bumped to the footnotes in my own recommendations is because during the pandemic, the price of your microphone surged. And now it's the same price, over $100, as some of the other USB mics. So based on the price change, that's why my opinion changed, but it's still a great mic.
See, that is some in-depth research right there. You didn't just go like, oh, this is a good audio mic, like get this one. You're like looking at the prices and be like, well, based on the price change, now it's not as good. Like that's amazing. So
I try to update all of my recs annually. So my favorite podcast microphones and my favorite podcast hosting platforms, I update annually. And just to give a quick sentence on what that means, if you're newer to podcasting, you may assume, in a smart guess kind of way, that you'd have to take each episode and give it to Apple and then give it to Spotify and do all of these different publishing steps for every new episode. But fortunately, that's not the case. There is an online tool called your podcast hosting platform that you upload all of your content into, including your podcast artwork, your title, all of your episodes. You schedule them for release, and then they add them to an RSS feed, which Apple and Spotify and all the listening directories keep on file, so that anytime you publish a new episode in your one tool, universally it will appear everywhere. So different hosting platforms offer different benefits, things like better analytics, better future-proof features. Like a big new trend in 2022 is going to be dynamic content insertion. If we want to get nerdy, we can talk about that. But I'm always updating my recs based on who I think has the most user-friendly platform, the best customer support, and who is constantly rolling out new features to support present day and future podcasting versus podcasting of 10 years ago.
That is absolutely, and that's something I'm about to get into because I'm on Libsyn. And again, when I first started podcasting back in 2016 is when I first started, Libsyn was kind of like the go-to. You know, it had been around for so long, but now I feel like all of these other companies out there have really grown their legs and are more user-friendly than Libsyn.
I agree. And Libsyn is one of the originals in the space, like you said. And hearing about your mic and your hosting platform, I could have already guessed that you started podcasting between like 2015 and 2018 because those were the top recs of the time. Yep. And it is tricky because things evolve so much. And Libsyn is still a great platform, but because I mentioned dynamic content insertion, I'll say what that means. So right now, if you upload your podcast episode, it plays straight through, start to finish. But if you imagine watching your favorite TV show, like I'm a big fan of Survivor, there are commercial breaks. And so when they produce that episode of Survivor, there are timestamps in that TV episode where they've said a commercial will go here. But if it runs in syndication later on, a different commercial will play. And that's the basic premise of dynamic content insertion. It means that in the future, you could swap out different ads in your podcast based on what is present. And so Libsyn is not one of the hosting platforms that is currently talking about that feature and some of the other bigger players in the space, I should say growing players in the space are. So those are the kinds of trends that I pay attention to.
So I do know that Libsyn, they have it right now in beta, testing dynamic ad insertion, but it also costs about $150 a month to get that feature. It is
which ain't nobody got time for.
Expensive. Yeah,
No.
like I pay $15 a month and I'm able to host more than I need on Libsyn right now. So to 10x that spending just to have that, like you would have to have a giant podcast to justify that, whereas you can go to so many other platforms and have that ability for much less money. So that's why I'm going to be checking out. I'm about to launch a new podcast about conferences. So I'm going to be checking out some other hosts like Buzzsprout and Blueberry and all of the other ones that are out there now, and checking those out. And I know you recommend Buzzsprout and a couple others, Captivate. What's your favorite one right now? Which one are you using?
Buzzsprout and Captivate are my two favorites. I have used all of them, whether it's been for my own podcasts or with students and clients. I've used at least 10, if not more. But wow. Buzzsprout and Captivate are the two I recommend the most. They hit all the criteria. They have some of the best analytics, not only for the podcast, but at a per episode level. They have really friendly customer support. They have a simple, easy to use interface. And then in different ways, they're both, I think, on the cutting edge of trends in the industry. I think with Buzzsprout, they will be the most affordable option if you only have one podcast, but they charge per podcast. Captivate charges in a different way, where you can have unlimited podcasts, but you do move up to different pricing tiers based on how many downloads or listens you get per month. So for anybody with multiple podcasts like you, I would definitely recommend Captivate. And I think one of the most interesting things that Captivate is doing is they're trying to capitalize on network effects between shows. So for example, cross promotion between two podcasts, where maybe I drop a feed, I do a feed drop in your podcast. That means an episode of mine might play in your podcast, or a trailer for my podcast might play in your podcast. There are other strategies like that where different hosts are collaborating, and Captivate is trying to make it easier for hosts to do that and to actually see analytics instead of just giving the other host a file and saying, good luck with that. So I think Captivate is really on the edge of network effects for podcast hosts, while Buzzsprout is still very much a leader in this space in terms of being very user-friendly and giving podcast hosts all of the data at their fingertips in a non-techie way.
That's really cool. I did not know that about Captivate. I have heard briefly about Captivate, but I feel like they're kind of newer. I could be wrong, but
they are.
That's kind of okay. That's kind of the vibe I'm getting.
What's interesting, just because you mentioned that they're newer, I worked at Teachable for 4 years, the course creation platform. So I know a little bit about how tech companies operate and think, certainly not how all of them operate. But I think that there is an advantage to being first, but there's also an advantage to coming in later, because you've already seen what's working and you can get started based on what is happening presently. And so I think that could be a challenge that Libsyn is facing because they've been around for so long. And it's harder for them to evolve their very robust existing technology at the snap of a finger. But Captivate coming in, I think maybe 2 or 3 years ago, 4 at max, they had the advantage of knowing what trends had already passed and were no longer relevant to podcasting. So just because they're newer doesn't mean they're worse or less reliable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love, like you said, for that reason, they're smaller, they can maneuver more. I love it. And you talked briefly, I kind of want to ask about this, having the cross promotion. So I'm the videographer for Podcast Movement. I don't know if you've heard of that conference, world's biggest podcast conference. I'm their videographer. So I was actually popping in one of their sessions, and he had this graph, and it was broken down of like all of the podcasts in certain niches and all this kind of stuff. And you could see how when somebody gets into a world of marketing, let's say, like they'll bounce around to different podcasts in that space. So you have this whole circle, and then you'll have this marketing bubble over here, and there'll be like the top marketing podcasts, and they all share listeners. Everybody's listening to it. So having that cross promotion element with Captivate could be a huge way to grow just within a bubble of your own peers. Is that kind of what that's doing?
It is. It's definitely a trend into 2022 that I think more podcasters will start to use. A lot of hosts to date, just again to recap, the premise is each of us have our own shows, but what we could do to help build up each other's audiences is give each other a little promo, like a 2-minute episode, a mini-sode, and then you put it in the other person's podcast. So it's released as an episode. And the benefit is that that host is basically endorsing your show. Some people also do this not as a feed drop, but they'll just put a little peek at the beginning of an episode in the same way that you might hear a sponsor ad read. Instead of a sponsor, maybe you hear your favorite host say, before we get into today's episode, I'm excited to introduce you to one of my favorite new podcasts, title here. And then you hear a little bit about that show. And I think a lot more podcasters are going to start to collaborate because to me, being a podcast host has really opened doors to partner with other people. You get to interview people on your own show if that's your format, and you get to meet so many incredible people and get really curious about what they do. I think being a host makes you a great guest to go on other podcasts because not only do you have a microphone and you sound great, you're comfortable perhaps, but you also have your own values, expertise, passions, whatever it is to share with a new audience. And my one tip we can give today about partnership is it's not about having the same topic, it's about having the same listener. So that way you're talking to the same person, but you each have a unique expertise that you can bring to that person. So that's what I look for in a good partnership opportunity.
That's brilliant. And again, another thing they say at Podcast Movement, I've heard so many speakers talk about running ads and all this kind of stuff. They say to run ads on other podcasts because your potential listeners are already podcast listeners. They're listening to other podcasts. You don't want to try to convert somebody who's never heard of a podcast. That's a harder conversion. Whereas if they're already in an app listening to podcasts, it's easier. And having like a lot of people join networks, like podcast networks are becoming like a big thing. I feel I've talked to so many people trying to start podcast networks, all that kind of stuff. But one of the benefits is that they cross promote each other's shows. So like John Lee Dumas from Entrepreneurs on Fire just joined the HubSpot podcast network, and he promotes other shows on his shows. So everybody in that network grows from each other's audience. It's kind of like that without officially creating a network, cross promotion on each other's podcasts. And I love the idea of like taking one of your episodes and putting it in my feed as like a podcast takeover day and just sharing one of your episodes in my feed. I think that's a really cool way to promote and add value. That's
yeah.
so
And I
cool.
think that's a great example because Captivate really is trying to empower more independent podcasters to have the benefits of being in a network. They are trying to help people almost create their own mini unofficial networks of the people you know and the audiences that you could all build on with together. So I think that was a perfect comparison.
We've talked about the creation. We've talked about the tech you need, that kind of stuff. So growing your podcast. I know you just put out an episode about this. What would you suggest to people who, okay, we've got the podcast, we got the tech, we've launched. How do I get people to download it? How would you tell them to grow their show?
Well, I'm happy to answer it, but I also want to start by maybe debunking a myth about podcast growth, because as you said, we all talk about this. How do I find more listeners? People ask it all the time. Mm-hmm. But I don't think people understand that podcasting is not about gaming an algorithm. It's more like building up a business or a blog. Because in the world of YouTube, to give a contrast, you go to YouTube, it's a search engine. YouTube has an algorithm and people will go there, type in a query, and different videos will pop up. And so there is discoverability within YouTube. The world of podcasting is not quite like that. Like, sure, you could go to Apple and maybe type in a phrase and find a new show, but I'm curious if you agree with this. I think most people find podcasts through things like word of mouth, through things like finding out about the person in some other world. They heard you on a podcast. They saw you on Instagram. They found a pin of yours on Pinterest. They found a blog post. They were searching for something. They find you somehow, and then they realize that you have a podcast. But Apple itself is not an algorithm. And people think that the whole point is to try to grow enough so that you can hit the charts so that you can keep growing. And 5+ years ago, yeah, there were some charts. There was something called New and Noteworthy. There were ways that if you succeeded early on as a new show, you could get picked up by Apple and then you could grow. But when I was running Teachable's podcast, we became the #2 career podcast in the US, and absolutely nothing changed about our analytics. And so today I bring that up because charting in Apple is a sign of growth. It is not a cause of growth. So when you're asking the question, how do I find more listeners for my podcast? You have to start thinking more like a blogger or more like a business owner, because you are running an independent creative project and you need to figure out where your people are in order to start growing.
That's the perfect answer. And I totally agree. I know you asked if I do, and so many people, because this is a marketing podcast, I tell people when they ask that question, it's like, well, what are you doing outside of publishing your episodes? Because like you said, searching for it in iTunes or Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts, it doesn't work like an algorithm. It's not indexing everything we say to be able to search through that podcast. So, I went before I had my marketing podcast, went on iTunes and typed in marketing podcast, and sure, the top 3 shows pop up every time, but sometimes you want to get a little deeper into a topic or find somebody who's growing something a little different. The best way I found to do that was just going to Google at that point and Googling for marketing podcasts and finding where maybe somebody made a list of them, or finding their own specific website where they talk about having a podcast on the topic. Like you said, that's how I found the shows, not through going on iTunes. It just never worked.
Yeah. And I think to give something specific, I would recommend for podcasters of any experience level, when people come to me and their show isn't growing or they're brand new and they're not sure where to start, when I ask people about their marketing strategy, they talk about things like publishing their episodes. They talk about emailing it to their list. They talk about perfecting their Instagram grid. They talk about LinkedIn. But the problem is that all of those are owned media channels, and too often they're skipping earned media. So the difference is that an owned media channel is anywhere that you have a domain or you have a profile. Your website, your podcast, any social media handles that you have, those are all spaces that you're putting content out on the internet. And although those are all wonderful, typically you're talking to pools of people who already know about you. And yeah, there are algorithms. You could go viral on social media. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I'm saying for the majority of us, when we are talking to those audiences, they are of people who have heard of us previously. So the problem is that it caps your growth potential. You're going to feel like your numbers are stagnant. So what you need to do in order to grow is to put yourself in front of new audiences. And that's where earned media comes in. That's things like being a speaker at a virtual or an in-person event, or going to meetups, being a guest blogger, going on other podcasts, as we talked about earlier, I think is one of the top strategies that any podcast host can add to her repertoire. So you have to think about which audiences to put yourself in front of. And that way, those people are coming back into your world. And then your podcast becomes the way that you continue to build relationships with them.
Yeah, I talk about this on my show a little bit. I call them tags. They're my target audience gatekeepers.
Mm-hmm.
And it's who has your target audience. Like you said, who out there, where can you go? What conference can you speak at? What podcast can you guest on where your target audience might be there? And get in there and be in front of them, do a good job. And that's how you grow your stuff. Whether it's your business, your podcast, your blog, whatever it is, you got to find out where the people are and go there.
Exactly. And I think that for anybody worried that you aren't big enough, you're not an influencer, you couldn't possibly be a podcast guest, there are so many hosts who are just getting started. They have audiences of your size too. So it's true, you can't jump from like 0 to a billion and try to get on the biggest podcast in your industry, but there are plenty of peers around you. And so start off by partnering with people who are around your size or maybe slightly more established. And then as you start to grow, your clout will grow and you'll be able to book bigger and bigger shows.
Yep, absolutely. So we've covered so much on the show. The last thing I want to talk about is monetization, because everybody wants to make money. So what would you suggest for, you have a podcast, you've put it out there, you've started to grow it with these tips now you want to make some money. What would you say?
So to, I guess, like briefly get up on a little bit of a soapbox, this is a part of the industry that I feel is broken, because when we look at our favorite shows, a lot of them are huge established podcasts and they're earning money through sponsorship. They have other revenue streams too, but that's what we hear. We hear Blue Apron everywhere. We hear ZipRecruiter, right? So
Casper.
What we have, it's everywhere. So what we have learned indirectly is that sponsorship is the way to earn money. And so the goal we have is start a podcast, build up a large enough audience, eventually pitch sponsors, and then we profit. To me, this is backwards though, because that hinges on you monetizing your audience. It's a direct monetization strategy, but there are so many other ways, especially as business owners, that we can treat our podcast as a marketing channel to promote our own products and services, to even be an affiliate or a referral partner for some of our favorite things. If you have a book, a podcast is a great partner for a book, present or future. There's so many ways that you can leverage your podcast to earn money. And to give a specific dollar amount, in all over 100 episodes I've ever hosted, I've only had a sponsor once, and it was just to prove a point. And I knew how to pitch above industry rates. And I was able to earn $120 for a 2-episode deal for Wit Wire. By contrast, I had a different episode. And at the end of that episode, I gave a call to action to book a discovery call with me because I was doing done for you podcast launch packages at the time. I no longer have those. I have courses only, but I had one call to action in that episode, and people cited it in their intake call with me. So from that episode, I earned at least $4,500.
Whoa.
And those episodes came out.
Difference.
Yeah, they came out within 2 months of each other. So my audience size was not different. So if there's one takeaway I could give anybody tuning in and wondering, how do I monetize my podcast? I would just urge you to think about ways that you can treat your podcast as a marketing channel and to not be so afraid to sell your own business to your listeners, because remember, they trust you. Your product, services, whatever they are, physical or intangible, probably solve the problem that they have currently because they trust you for a reason. And by not talking about your business, you're actually doing them a disservice. So I don't want hosts to worry about being too salesy. The mistake would be to make your whole podcast an infomercial. That's not the point. But instead, what you can do, I think the most natural way is near the end of an episode. Let's say you were an anxiety coach and you had been talking about something specific in the episode. At the end, maybe you say, if this resonated with you, but you are curious to dive a little bit deeper, I am currently taking on new clients. And you can book a free strategy call with me at URL here and get really clear on who it's for and what they should be doing. And that's how you can start to earn money right from episode 1.
Yeah, that's what I've heard from a few people about sponsoring your own show. I think, like you said, it makes the most sense because then you're not getting either a fraction of the sale or whatever, or you're not getting just a small kickback because your audience isn't 130,000 downloads a month. Like you said, like the mega podcasters out there, but you get to keep all the money and it grows your business.
Exactly.
I think that's the absolute best way to do it. I just recently started sponsoring my own show in the sense that I never had any, it's really bad as a marketer, as an online entrepreneur, all this kind of stuff, never had a call to action in my show. And the last few episodes, people have noticed that the beginning and the end, I have a call to action, just asking people to share the podcast with somebody. If they know like a small business owner or entrepreneur, share the show with them. And I actually, in October, had my largest month ever when I started that. Like, saw a giant spike and like it leveled off higher than it was because I started just asking. That's the only thing I changed in my show, was asking people to share it. So definitely a great piece of advice for monetization. You have a podcast, go ahead and create something to sell, whether that's coaching or courses like Melissa here, and use that as your own promotion.
Yeah,
market
I love
your
that.
own podcast. Yeah. That's
also
super cool.
asking people to help you share your podcast. It sounds obvious because you might assume, oh, they'll just do it. But the truth is that we do need to give clear direction to listeners. It's a kindness to them to say, wow, it would be so helpful for me if you knew another online business owner. And for anybody tuning in, like if you're enjoying this episode and somebody in your life would benefit from learning about podcasting or any of Matt's marketing strategies, I hope they do pass this along. And you have to ask people. And I think you would be surprised by how many people want to support you. And all of the top podcasts I know, they all credit word of mouth as one of their biggest growth strategies. And the only ways that you'll grow through word of mouth are, number 1, creating great content. And then number 2, asking your fans for support.
Yep. I mean, that's the best way to do it. And I learned the tip while watching YouTube videos because, you know, every YouTube video you watch, it's make sure to subscribe and hit that like button and ring the bell, that kind of stuff. It's them telling you, do these 3 things if you like the video, hit the, you know, like, I was like, why am I not doing that on my own show? Like my own podcast, I'm not even asking people to share it or anything. So I started doing it. And that's like you said, word of mouth. Again, this isn't my first podcast. In my last one, it was a podcast for photography and videography businesses. That was the number 1 method of growth that everybody mentioned, was having good word of mouth. So that's the best way to grow your podcast and then monetize it on your own. I think, Melissa, this podcast episode has been like the the go-to podcasting episode. I'm going to cite this episode when I create my podcasting course, which is going to be awesome because it's going to also promote your stuff. So one more time, I want to shout out yourself, witandwire.com. Go there to check out everything you could possibly want to know about podcasting and about Melissa. Melissa, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show today.
Yeah, I had so much fun. Thank you again for having me.
Awesome. For everybody out there listening and watching along, thank you for taking the time to be here. Remember, go to witandwire.com/Matt Pete to get that podcast launch checklist. I hope this episode encourages you and inspires you to go out there and create your own podcast. Remember that marketing really matters. If you know someone who has a business that could use some help marketing their business, take a second and share this podcast with them. Thank you so much and have an awesome day.